Between June 2022 and June 2023, signs of anti Western rhetoric began emerging from Georgia's ruling Georgian Dream regime. This rhetoric intensified during debates over the law and transparency of foreign influence, commonly referred to as a foreign agent law or Russian law, sparking mass protests in March 2023, which later reignited in 2024 and continued to the present. Welcome to the CRRC-Georgia podcast. A frequent criticism of Georgia's ruling regime has been its embracing, promotion, and proliferation of what are characterized as anti-Western narratives. The Georgian Dream, GD, government, once pro-EU integration and even an observing member of the Party of European Socialists, has since taken a hard, right-wing, Eurosceptic, illiberal, and anti-democratic turn. But what does this turn look like in the Georgian context? What exactly are the narratives that GD promotes on Facebook? Today, we'll walk through the 2024 study from CRRC-Georgia and the Social Justice Center, the spread of anti-Western narratives coming from authorities on Facebook, analyzing how these anti-Western narratives emerged, spread, and evolved on the most popular social media platform in Georgia. We'll examine who promoted these messages, what specific narratives appeared, and how they change over time. Before we dive into the findings, let me briefly outline the methodology used in this study. Our study analyzed a one-year period from June 2022 to June 2023. We began by examining statements and written announcements from key government and former government figures. Then Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili, GD Secretary Shava Papuashvili, Parliamentary Majority Leader, now Prime Minister Irakli Obekhidze, Party Chairman Mamuk Abdinaradze, Tbilisi Mayor Kakhakaladze, and members of Khalkhizala, or People's Power, a Georgian Dream offshoot political movement that initiated the foreign agent law. Based on these official statements, we identified anti-Western narratives and extracted keywords. We then used these keywords to collect relevant Facebook posts shared by party officials, media, public Facebook groups, and individuals through CrowdTangle, gathering 6,280 posts in total. Via analysis, 2,243 posts were deemed relevant and formed the basis of our findings. We divided the study period into 4 phases corresponding to key developments around the law and transparency of foreign influence. This phased approach allowed us to track how narratives evolved over time. Our analysis revealed a consistent pattern throughout the entire year. Discrediting of non-governmental organizations, the opposition, and the West appeared in Facebook posts across all phases. The top 5 most frequently mentioned actors were the opposition party United National Movement, Russia, the West, the United States, and NGOs. Aside from Russia, all of these actors were portrayed negatively in the vast majority of cases. For the UNM and NGOs, there were 0 positive mentions. 97% of posts mentioning the UNM were negative, as were 96% of posts mentioning NGOs. 9 out of every 10 posts portrayed the West negatively. Russia was the exception. It appeared neutrally in more than 50% of posts, and 13% of posts portrayed Russia positively, the highest level of positive mentions among the top actors. Now let's explore how these narratives developed across all 4 phases. The first phase, from June through October 2022, was characterized by relatively covert anti-Western rhetoric. The main emphasis was on discrediting NGOs and the opposition. Western organizations or countries were mentioned only indirectly as their funders. The discourse portrayed NGOs as a clan of rich NGOs, receiving millions from foreign organizations while serving their interests rather than Georgia's. 3 organizations faced particular scrutiny: Transparency International Georgia, the International Society for Fair Elections and Democracy, and the Georgian Young Lawyers Association. They were accused of lacking transparency, distorting Georgia's image abroad, and being ready to accept any order from their funders. NGOs in the opposition, specifically the UNM, were frequently linked together and represented as essentially the same force. They are portrayed as traitors of the country acting against the Orthodox religion and the Georgian nation. A crucial development occurred in August 2022, when 4 Georgian Dream MPs founded Khalkhizala, the People's Power movement. After this, anti-Western rhetoric became more specific and direct. The former U.S. ambassador to Georgia, Kelly Degnan, became a particular target of criticism and was even accused of attempting to overthrow the government and drag Georgia into war. The concept of a global game also emerged, with People's Power speaking more openly about what they described as the West's main goal: dragging Georgia into war and having Georgia open a second front against Russia. During this phase, the main disseminators of these narratives were news media outlets, including TV Imedi, Media Holding Quira, Interpress News, Post TV, and Georgian Times. Posts were often shared by party officials, media outlets, and individuals who, strangely enough, were overwhelmingly portrayed as middle-aged and elderly women, and whose profiles' authenticity were often difficult to verify. Public groups became important spaces for spreading these narratives as well, including both openly pro government groups and groups consisting of conservative movement supporters. The second phase, from November 2022 to mid February 2023, saw the emergence of new key concepts and an intensification of anti Western rhetoric. Two terms became prominent during this period. First, agentocracy and agents, used to suggest that the West, particularly the United States, wanted to plant its agents in the Georgian government. Second, the phrase global war party appeared. This sometimes referred to the UNM, also labeled the local war party or party of war and betrayal, and at other times to what was described as a collective of anti Georgian forces from the US, Ukraine, and the EU. The narrative about dragging Georgia into war remained prominent. Post claimed that NGOs, the opposition, and Western actors were attempting to involve Georgia in the war in Ukraine and open a second front against Russia. While the US ambassador had been the main foreign target in Phase 1, after October 2022, negative discourse toward European Parliament members intensified, especially after the European Commission gave Georgia its 12-point recommendations. Specific European MPs were named and accused of being agents, being friends of a radical opposition, and unjustly persecuting Bidzina Ivanishvili, the founder and honorary chairman of the ruling Georgian Dream Party. A significant development in this phase was the emergence of narratives about values and religion. The West, particularly European institutions, were accused of promoting LGBT propaganda, fighting against the Georgian Orthodox Church, and attempting to impose alien values on Georgia. Europe was portrayed as being in a moral and spiritual crisis, having lost the values important to Georgia. The narrative of two Europes began to spread. One Europe was described as the Europe Georgia aspires to join, with values that led Georgia to choose this path. The second Europe was portrayed as weakened and devoid of these values. Ukraine was often represented in a negative context, sometimes as part of the global effort to drag Georgia into war, and sometimes as an example of the situation Georgia would find itself in if it obeyed Western instructions. Posts containing anti Western narratives during this phase were often based on statements from People's Power members. Disseminators include media outlets like Post TV and Imedi, as well as private profiles, some of which raised doubts about authenticity. The third phase covers the period from the Law on Transparency of Foreign Influence's initiation in mid February until its withdrawal on March 10, 2023, the period when mass protests were taking place. The most common narrative during this phase stated that the law was similar to the American Foreign Agents Registration Act, that its goal was transparency, and that calling it Russian was a lie. The narrative emphasized that the law was Georgian and differed from similar American and Russian laws in that it did not violate human rights standards. NGOs were portrayed as opposing the law because they did not want their finances exposed, and they didn't want it revealed that they were serving Western interests and spreading Western propaganda. The phrase, "Rirse bit Evropisken," with dignity towards Europe, emerged as a prominent slogan. The narrative discussed moving toward Europe while maintaining sovereignty and religion. This continues the two Europes theme from Phase 2. One Europe toward which Georgia is striving, which has values, and a second Europe that is weakened, devoid of these values, and wants Georgia to submit to its will. The narrative also stated that this second Europe was, through NGOs, propagating LGBT ideals and fighting against the Orthodox Church and the Patriarch of Georgia. The war narrative continued, with claims that Georgia was not granted EU candidate status because it refused to open a second front. The opposition and NGOs were again equated, described as wanting disorder, regime change through revolution, and the return of former President Mikhail Saakashvili and the UNM. Behind them, the narratives claimed, stood the West, and this would eventually lead Georgia being dragged into war, putting it in a situation similar to Ukraine's. Unlike previous phases, anti Western narratives in this phase mostly came from government leaders. Posts based on statements from Irakli Gobachidze, Gachak Aladze were frequent. People's Power and its representatives remained active, along with government supporting experts and political analysts. Phase 4 covers approximately 2 months after Parliament revoked the law, from March 10th to June 2023. This phase continued emphasizing the law's goals, its transparency, and similarities to laws in the US and other Western countries. It also continued discussing funding of certain groups by the West, claiming they were attempting to organize a coup. Given that young people actively participated in the March 2023 protests, government rhetoric focused particularly on them. On the one hand, it was emphasized that the government revoked the law to protect young people and ensure their safety, suggesting young protesters had been misled. On the other hand, these young people were discredited. They were referred to as, quote, gender confused, anarchists, and sometimes even Satanists, who were, quote, poisoned by Bolshevism, neoliberalism, and club drugs. In both framings, the rhetoric suggested these youth were being used, consciously or unconsciously, by the radical opposition in the West. In this context, Georgi, more freedom, the Franklin Club, Ilias State University, and the Free University were frequently mentioned. New terms emerged during this phase: liberal fascism and neo Bolshevism, both directed at opponents of the law. These individuals were accused of fighting against their own nation and using Bolshevik methods to persecute those with differing opinions, specifically bullying law supporting MPs, their family members, children, professors, and teachers. Criticism and discrediting of then President Salome Zurabishvili continued. She was portrayed as a supporter and leader of the radical opposition as well as an agent of the West. The war threat narrative continued. The theme of Western sanctions against Russia was used, with arguments that demanding Georgia join these sanctions would lead to military escalation with Russia, meaning the West wanted to drag Georgia into war. As in Phase 3, anti Western posts were primarily based on statements of current and former government leaders, particularly Irakli Kobechidze and Irakli Garibashvili. So, to return to our initial question, what are the narratives Georgian Dream pushes on Facebook? Based on CRRC-Georgia's analysis of 2,243 Facebook posts from June 2022 to June 2023, Georgian Dream consistently discredits NGOs, the opposition, and the West. The rhetoric evolved from covert messaging focusing on NGO funding to direct attacks naming specific Western officials and institutions. Key concepts central to this discourse include the Global War Party, agentocracy, with dignity toward Europe, and the two Europes. These narratives weave together themes of sovereignty threats, attacks on traditional values and religion, warnings about dragging Georgia into war, and accusations of Western hypocrisy. The dissemination ecosystem involves official government sources, pro government media, supporting analysts, and networks of social media accounts, some verified, others of questionable authenticity. Thank you for joining us for this analysis. You can find the cited report in the episode's description. For more information, studies like this, and podcast episodes, visit our website crrc.ge, and make sure to follow us on social media at CRRC-Georgia. Until next time.